have heard of Jones Island. I do not know of its location, and I did not know the island was once inhabited by the Kashubes.
I've lived in Milwaukee all my life, and I didn't know anything about the Jones Island fishing village until I started my internship with urban anthropology.
All I knew was that it was a place where they dumped a lot of salt and where the port of Milwaukee was. I had no idea that there was actually a community on the island.
As far as I knew, Jones Island was a place where Milwaukee processed sewage. I mean, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I lived in this city for nearly 40 years. I didn't know about the Kashubian village on the island. I surely didn't know that a less complex society, the kind that anthropologists study in more remote areas of the world, had actually thrived well into the 20th century right here in this city.
What and where is Jones Island? Who were the Kashubes who lived on the island? When did they live there, and where are they today? These are questions a group of anthropologists in Milwaukee, Wisconsin asked as they began their search for survivors of the Jones Island fishing village and their descendants. First, what and where is Jones Island? Today, the area called Jones Island is a mile-long peninsula along the shoreline of Milwaukee. It's bordered on the east by Lake Michigan, on the north and west by the Kinnickinnic River, and it connects to the mainland at its southern tip. The peninsula is currently home to Milwaukee's largest sewage treatment plant, mountains of road salt, boxcars and railroad tracks, lift docks, warehouses, petroleum tanks, and a tiny park that commemorates the days of the Kashubes and their fishing village. Why is a peninsula called Jones Island? Over a series of habitations, the topography of the peninsula was altered by both human and natural intrusions. The name derives in part from a Captain James Monroe Jones, who built an important shipyard on the peninsula in the mid-19th century. With growth in commerce, lake vessels needed better access to Milwaukee's rivers. In 1857, the city completed a straight cut across the peninsula, eliminating nearly a mile of tortuous river channel for grateful lake captains. The straight cut severed the peninsula's connection to the mainland, hence came the designation island. However, within a decade, storm waves filled the island's old river mouth with sand, and the island was once again a peninsula. But the name Jones Island persisted.
What you have to really understand about Jones Island is that in the early years, everyone and everything came by water. And Jones Island was Milwaukee's front door. That was the first thing you saw. That was the entry point to Milwaukee.
And who were the populations that settled on the island?
Jones Island was certainly a main settlement in the Milwaukee area. In historic times, there was a Potawatomi chief named Onatissa, who was the chief of the village on the island. And obviously, you look out toward the lake and it's a canoe route. You look inland, you have access to resources, everything from the wild rice of the Menominee Valley Marsh to the waterfowl in that marsh to fish in the river that went right past the wigwams of the native settlers. So that was an important native settlement, and because the natives were there, it became naturally an important fur trading post. And a man named Alexander Laframboise was one of the traders who put up his post almost literally in the native village. As European settlement accelerates, you begin to get an urban experience, an urban aspiration at least on the Milwaukee area. Jones Island becomes the focal point of shipbuilding. And in the 1850s, a man named James Monroe Jones, who was out of Buffalo in the early years, puts his shipyard on what's now the western side of the riverside of Jones Island and starts what was the biggest shipyard in the Milwaukee area. There was probably at least one more on the island, and across from the island on the mainland in Walker's Point was the Wolf and Davidson shipyard, and they also had roots in the Jones business. So you have native, fur trader, Yankee shipbuilder in close succession on one site. And then, of course, followed by the Kashub and the Pomeranian fishermen. So you have some very distinct periods that are sort of microcosms of what was going on in the larger area during that long period of evolution.
The Kashubes were descendants of a Slavic tribe that settled on the Baltic Sea coast between 600 and 900 AD. Traditionally, most Kashubes relied on fishing for their subsistence. Over hundreds of years, their numbers dwindled, and many members of the remaining population settled on the Bay of Puck and the Hel Peninsula and the Baltic coast of Poland, a region later known as Kashubie. Although they had shared geographic areas with Prussians, and most particularly Poles, many members of these groups considered the Kashubes to be a separate ethnicity. The Kashubes themselves tended to self-identify as Poles. Most Kashubes lived in small, egalitarian villages in the coastal region with limited contact with the wider society. The Kashubian language, a Germanized Polish, is sometimes classified as a dialect of Polish and sometimes a separate language. Like the Poles and many Germans, the Kashubes of recent centuries were staunch Roman Catholics. Between 1775 and 1918, Poland was partitioned by Austria, Russia, and Prussia. In the 1870s, Prussian leader Bismarck initiated a Germanization policy in the western section of Poland designed to bar speaking of languages other than German, weaken the Catholic Church, and replace Polish landowners with German citizens. This policy and others related to partition led to massive emigrations of people from Poland in the late 19th century, including the Kashubes. Many came to the United States. The anthropologists interviewed descendants of many of these early immigrants.
They came over because the father had to serve in the German Navy when he was young, and he didn't want his boys to have to do that. So they came to the United States, and they had some distant relation in Colorado, and they went out there, but that was no place for anybody that was raised on the Balkan.
One of the settlement areas discovered by early Kashubian arrivals was Jones Island. The news of a vacant coastal area spread fast, and soon the earliest immigrants were joined by hundreds of other Kashubes.
My grandpa told me that he was only 4 years old when he came to this country, and he said that he was at top side and he saw the tip of an iceberg, and he told the captain about it. The captain was very happy and gave my grandpa 25 cents. A quarter then was a lot of money. So then eventually he was married here on Jones Island. My parents were born here, and so it be it.
They heard of Milwaukee's Jones Island, and they came here, and they knew a lot of people from their territory that came here that had been commercial fishermen in Germany. So they settled there. My father-in-law was 9 years old, and his brother was 11.
The new arrivals organized a fishing village on the island, although few residents ever held titles to the land. By the end of the 19th century, the population of the island village was between 1,200 and 1,600 people, most of them Kashubes from Poland, along with a small population of German-speaking Pomeranians and a handful of Norwegians and Irish.
You had the Germans on one side and the Polish on the other. But there were fights down there once in a while, but everybody got along, better than they do up here.
The Kashubes and the Germans really had their own ways, and the Kashubes were mainly Polish Catholic, and the Germans were German Lutheran. And the Kashubes went to St. Stanislaus School and churches, and the Germans went to St. Peter's, which was on 8th and Scott at that time, and they sent their children either to this private school or either to View School. At that it was called Greenbush, I think. It was in a different location.
What was life like on Jones Island? Anthropologists often contrast societies by their levels of complexity. The more complex societies, such as the one islanders would confront on the mainland, were usually class stratified with centralized forms of power or authority and formal means of social control. The Jones Island fishing village was an example of a less complex society. Less complex societies tend to be small. They often rely on procuring foods that are naturally available in the environment, such as fish, rather than producing much of their own food. These groups usually place high value on sharing, cooperation, and reciprocity. Few differences in status and wealth develop. The Kashubes carried many of their cooperative practices over from Poland. In Kashubie, as on Jones Island, 12 to 15 villagers would gather at the cottage of temporary leaders and decide how to divide up the workload or the cost of a new net or boat repairs. Each group was usually assigned exclusive rights to fish in certain spots. In less complex societies, the economic pursuits are highly integrated with other cultural practices. It's not surprising that the islanders centered most of their activities around water.
Mother told me that the activities consisted of a lot of water activities because of the access to the water, Lake Michigan and Milwaukee River. She said they had beach parties and they built bonfires and they celebrated the various holidays on the island, where they would, of course, and a lot of it had to do with fish because fish was there. They baked fish, fried fish.
My dad was a fisherman, and he also was a diver, and they used to go out on the lake, and they used to catch the fish, and then they fish the nets and all that stuff. They used to sew them and dry them out and hang them up.
But practices centered on water also carried dangers.
Parents wouldn't let you go into the river or the lake by yourself because they were afraid that you would drown. Half of us didn't know how to swim. Can you imagine something like that?
Leadership in less complex societies tends to be informal. The leaders, whether selected by consensus or self-appointed, have no permanent or enforceable authority. They often fill roles of redistributing resources.
My grandfather was he was called King of the Island, one of the founders. People had to come to him in order to, he gave them a parcel of land, or it was just like a postage stamp size.
Yeah, there were always, from the very early years, people on the island who were somewhat the informal mayors of this community. You have to recall this was largely an island of squatters. These were not people who had paid taxes or had clear title for their land, and it was the closest thing Milwaukee's ever had to a real urban village. So even though it didn't have any particular governmental body, there was a very strong sense of community and leaders would naturally emerge. The first one was Jacob Muja, who by legend was the first to arrive back in 1872 and became something of the patriarch for other people from the Baltic seacoast to come and settle on Jones Island. And over the years, you had men like Anton Kansky and Charlie Plambeck, who were the informal mayors. And Plambeck was actually a tavern keeper who would have fish fries at his saloon and actually ran a launch from downtown Bridge to Jones Island, and people would come out there on a weekend for sort of a walk on the wild side. But in his own home community, you know, he was something of the king. The last one would have been Felix Struck, and it was almost last by default. He was one of the last handful of families who survived that eviction by the city of Milwaukee back in the 1920s, and stayed as kind of the king of a shrinking kingdom until he was evicted back in 1943, and with that ended both the village and its mayors.
In less complex societies, settlement patterns are often based on immediate needs rather than formal planning. While some islanders invested considerable energy in their homes, houses and streets were usually built wherever there was room.
There were no distinct avenues or anything. They built where they wanted to. And some were nice homes. And my cousins, my husband's uncle, moved his house. It was too nice to leave on the island when they left it.
Even well into the 20th century, the villagers had few modern facilities on the island. Most relied on kerosene lamps and outhouses and drew their water from barrels sunk in the sandy soil. Less complex societies usually lack formal means of social control, such as councils of elders, intermediaries, police forces, and court systems. Less complex societies rely on more informal means of social control, such as socialization through kinship ties, gossip, and fear of supernatural sanctions. As non-tax-paying squatters, the islanders received few municipal services, such as law enforcement patrols. They generally policed themselves.
My whole family and our extended family all belonged to St. Stan's. That's where we were raised as parishioners. So I believe that it was religious-based, that there was a strong sense of family on the island.
In talking to my uncles, they were raised the same way here on the island. There was no supervision. They learned about nature and the island and everything else just by going out and doing. It was total freedom, flexibility. It was nothing like the way we raise our kids today, with programs and soccer activities followed by basketball and so forth. And I think we were raised that same way.
Fear of gossip or supernatural sanctions also played a role in social control on the island. 2 women on the island were labeled witches.
All the kids on the island thought that they were witches. They kind of kept to themselves. They didn't really bother anybody, from what I understand. But the kids were kind of suspicious of them and probably taunted them quite a bit. I had an aunt who believed heavily in the supernatural. She used to have a crystal ball, and they believed in it. And I think one of the reasons they believed so much in the supernatural was because they were kind of all to themselves out here. You know, they were kind of away from the city. I think that's what it boiled down to.
Because of the lack of social complexity and up-to-date technology on Jones Island, mainlanders had mixed perceptions of the islanders. As today, most of the mainlanders had little actual knowledge of the islanders' history, daily practices, and culture.
To other mainlanders, they were a source of fish, and they were certainly part of the nutrition of the greater Milwaukee area. And there was a certain group, especially artists and art students, who would tend to romanticize the islanders. They would make these drawing excursions to Jones Island, and they'd look at the drying reels for all the nets. Sort of the rather jerry-built and tumble-down buildings that the islanders lived in. And they had kind of they perhaps overly romanticized what was really a very human working-class community.
Some art students, including Carl Sandburg, came to the island on sketching trips. Other mainlanders were known to boat across the river just to gaze at the islanders.
That kind of sparked my interest when I heard that there was a captain with a cruise boat on weekends in the late 1890s going around the island showing people live there, you know.
Because many of the islanders sold fish or attended church and school on the mainland, they often had to deal with the ethnocentrism and prejudice of other Milwaukeeans.
All groups had different attitudes toward the people on Jones Island. For a lot of the mainland Poles, the Kashubes, who were the main group on Jones Island, were considered somewhat rustic, somewhat more primitive than the mainland Poles. And also they spoke kind of a Germanized Polish, so even their dialect was different. So they were looked at as somewhat separate and frankly in some cases inferior to the mainland Poles, although they worshipped at St. Stan's and were very much a part of the larger life of the community.
They'd have to take the boats over from the island to the mainland. And when they got at school, a lot of the mainland children teased them about fishermen and, you know.
It didn't make any difference to me. I came from Jones Island. That's what I liked it, and that's it. It didn't make any difference. I got mad when they'd call us about fish. You know, kids, you like a school, and if you get called on it, somebody's going to get mad. But we all liked our school, that I would say.
They were always treated like, what should I say? Like they were outcasts. A lot of people looked down on them because I know my husband's grandmother, she came to the mainland and she sold the fresh smoked fish in baskets and things. But that was some of their livelihood, and people were happy to get it.
The mainly Kashubian population on Jones Island formed the most important commercial fishing settlement in southeastern Wisconsin. Life in the Jones Island fishing village teemed with energy. The islanders' work and subsistence strategies were demanding, but so were the leisure time activities. A typical workday was 12 hours long.
They got up very early, and depending on their compasses of where their fishing nets were left, and they'd look for the floaters that they had on the nets. They each had distinctive ones that they could find their own nets. And they'd work as they went out, and after they picked their nets up, they had to pick through the nets for the fish because they'd be stuck on the net, the gills would be stuck. And then coming in, they would clean the fish out, and you'd always notice a lot of seagulls following those boats because they'd be eating the garbage that was thrown over. And then when they came on shore with the boats, the real work began. They'd have to wash the nets and patch them, and it was a hard life. You had to be pretty healthy to be in and out on the lake. And my father-in-law said the lake was worse sailing than the ocean because the waves were so choppy.
I heard the story of my mom telling me that her grandmother, who died in 1929, used to take fish wrapped up in newspaper and sell it on the North Shore area where people were a little more affluent. And that's how she supported, I believe, 10 kids.
Children often joined their parents in the daily work by the time they were 14. But even the youngest members of the family participated in subsistence activities.
There were railroad tracks on the island or just off of the island, and times were tough and money was hard to come by. So the kids were dispatched along the railroad tracks to pick up coal that would fall off of the railroad cars. And they would bring the coal home and they would use it as fuel.
By the turn of the 20th century, the children could attend kindergarten through 4th grade at an island public school. Beginning in the 5th grade, most of the Kashubian children were transferred to St. Stanislaus School, where fluency in Polish was required. Thus, most of the Jones Island children were trilingual, in their island dialect, Polish, and English. For all, access to and from the mainland nearly always involved crossing a waterway.
They did have people that were giving ferry service from the island to either the foot of Greenfield Avenue or the foot of National Avenue, and or the Mitchell Street area in through there, and of course you'd have to walk from there, getting out of the boat. And this ferry service, I think, ran for a designated amount of hours from a certain time to a certain time. So if you did miss the time that the ferry service was being provided, you had, like I say, either walk on the island to get to the island or swim. And I know that Stanley Conklin mentioned one time that he had missed a boat and he had to swim.
But as rigorous as the workload was on the island, leisure time activities involved no less energy.
At the height of the island in the late 1890s, there were almost 1,000 people living here and 12 saloons in this little peninsula land. So there's quite a bit of drinking going on, beer, drinking and partying, and the old saying was that the Kashubes drank, fished, and fight. Well, of course they did more than that, but that was the old saying, and they said in winter they didn't fish, so.
The plethora of adult recreational activities on the island drew mainlanders in large numbers.
The island itself was really a fun place to come to. If a person had a wedding here, it lasted for a week. And people came from all over Milwaukee, whether they were Kashubes or not, and just joined in the fun.
Anton Kansky had a tavern, and he was a very shrewd businessman, because what he would do was at lunchtime take a ferry across to the mainland, pick people up, bring them back to a saloon for beer and fish fries, and take them back to work.
There were fish fries in the taverns, and there were several taverns on the island. Fish fries every night, and people would come from the mainland to go to those fish fries. Dances, I think, almost every weekend. And of course, if enough beer were imbibed at the dances, there was leisure time fighting.
With the exuberance of life on the island, why did the fishing village disappear? The first threat to the village and its residents began as early as 1889, when the Illinois Steel Company, a huge iron mill just south of the settlement, wanted better docking facilities for its fleet of lake ships. Illinois Steel tried to evict the fisherfolk from the northern half of Jones Island using controversial claims based on tax deeds and the land title of a shipbuilding colleague of Captain Jones. The islanders held no formal claims to their village.
Illinois Steel, who had all the land just south of the fishing village, saw them as a pest that had to be removed. And they tried to evict the islanders one by one, and ultimately I think only got about 10% of them out. And that raised the interest of Milwaukee's socialists, who in their zeal for the underdog provided legal counsel for the islanders to fight. Jones, the Illinois Steel Company, Victor Berger, took an active role in that defense.
The battle with Illinois Steel raged on for nearly 20 years. Ultimately, the courts found irregularities in the company's claims to the land and the village, and most of its conflict-weary people stayed put for a time. But threats were to follow from another direction. The demands of the 20th century were beginning to encroach on the islanders' lives. They now faced pressures from government.
To the city of Milwaukee, I think the islanders were something of an anachronism. By the teens and 20s, they thought this was a village that had outlived its time. Milwaukee's growing, the river is an open sewer, the ships are too big to use the inner harbor, so Jones Island at Milwaukee's front door became the logical place for both a sewage treatment plant and for the outer harbor.
The city condemned the fishing village in 1914. However, the city, unlike the steel company, was willing to pay the residents for the land. The islanders, perhaps exhausted by the long court battles, or perhaps perceiving a futility of further confrontations, did not contest the city's eventual order to vacate the village. One by one, the Kashubes and others began to move off the island. By 1920, only 25 families remained. Most moved to Polish communities on Milwaukee's south side and east sides. Many who had left the island continued to maintain contact with the few that stayed behind.
So this would have been in the late 20s, early 30s that they used to come down here. And there were still a few people living on the island, but not many. So it was a special occasion to come to the island. My grandfather and grandmother were born and married on the island, and I believe they moved off in 1920, if I'm not mistaken.
I visited here as a little girl, and I was in Felix Struck's tavern when I was a little girl. I remember it very painfully. A wooden floor of the tavern and the wood-burning stove. Well, it was a pot belly. Perhaps it was coal maybe, coal stove.
The village's last informal mayor, Felix Struck, was the final islander to leave. He operated his tavern on the island until 1943. At age 74, Struck and his family were formally evicted. Although some continued to fish elsewhere, most of the Kashubes who moved to the mainland ended up taking jobs in industry. Many of their descendants describe a relatively smooth transition to life away from the island.
Well, I think it is a remarkable thing how well the Jones Island people assimilated into other cultures in the Bayview area. It only took maybe 2 or 3 generations before there was complete assimilation.
Did the Kashubes simply disappear into a mainland melting pot?
I didn't know anything about my background, as my dad never mentioned much about the island at all. And through my marriage to Walter, he's the one who was interested in genealogy, and he did all the research for me in regards to my grandfather and family history.
My mother and father had 6 children, all boys, of which I am the oldest. And I believe that my youngest brother, Ron, is probably the youngest Kashube in captivity. Yeah, he was born the youngest son of a youngest son, and I think he's the youngest of all the Kashubes that are around. Full-blooded Kashube. That's it.
Has anything remained of Kashubian cultural practices?
I like the tradition of the island, you know, as far as any traditions themselves being passed along. I can't think of any offhand.
No, they don't do that stuff anymore that it was.
All the culture is gone?
All the culture's gone, just about, yeah.
But is it? Cultural anthropologists point out the ways that traditions are passed on through pattern practices or learning through doing rather than learning exclusively through formal teaching. Interviews with descendants of islanders revealed considerable continuity of practices. One example was their ongoing relationship to water.
Well, having backgrounds as Jones Islanders, water was a central pivotal point in life. You're working basically on a peninsula, and you often traveled to and from there in boats. And actually, when you had boats around also, there's always competition and water sports that would occur. It's been, I've had 2 sailboats, I'll take that back. I've had 3 sailboats already in my lifetime. My grandfather had one and my father had one.
There was no concerted effort where you would sit down and talk about Kashubian history. I never really knew what a Kashube was. I just knew that that was life as I knew it. Well, that's something that I probably picked up early on as a kid, and that's what I do now. I'm a civil engineer. I still work on waterfront projects. And in fact, you know, right now I'm working on the Milwaukee Lakefront project.
The traditions of the Jones Islanders were kept on. Many of them remained boat owners. Always interested in water sports and proud of their heritage.
Islanders of necessity were seafood eaters. They loved seafood, and I think all the descendants of the islanders are still the same way.
And what about Kashubian party life?
Another aspect of that culture is parties like this. We go to a wedding, and the wedding always lasted 3 or 4 days. I thought that was normal until I moved to Madison. And, you know, I would wonder why the party wasn't starting on a Thursday and why you didn't continue to have a party on a Sunday. Well, in our culture, that was normal. I mean, you went out on Friday night and then you partied all day Saturday, and then on Sunday you opened the gifts, it was another party. And so I think it was just something that was handed down over the picnic tables in each of the parks here in Milwaukee. And, you know, it's something I tell my kids about.
A somewhat recent addition to Kashubian party life is their annual picnic. In 1974, the city of Milwaukee constructed a tiny park to commemorate the fishing village on the exact site of Felix Struck's tavern.
What I'm holding here is a sketch of the Felix Struck saloon, which was on this site before it was torn down and everybody was removed to the mainland. And this sketch that I made was going to be used in the museum out at the State Fair. And later on it will go into the Pabst Brewing Company in the permanent museum that'll be down there. But it's a scaled down version of that original saloon. There were many on the island here, of course, and there's a great variety of activities. And this little park was a site of a lot of activities like we're having today.
It wasn't probably until the 80s that we brought back the Kashube picnic. There was quite a few Kashubes at Elm Bradley, and we got together and organized a picnic. We all pitched in for the beer, and it was something similar to this, only we didn't have the music, but everybody bought their own food and your own chairs, and everybody pitched in for the beer. And then it dissipated, and now these gentlemen, Jim and his brother, had brought it back.
Today, the Kashubes from Jones Island have come full circle. As immigrants from the Baltic coast in Poland, they squatted on a mile-long peninsula within metropolitan Milwaukee. Here, they organized a fishing village that thrived for over 50 years. Although the Kashubes made major contributions to the area's maritime industry, few mainland Milwaukeeans knew much about the daily practices of these urban villagers. Their days were filled with rigorous and dangerous work and an equally demanding recreational life. The Kashubes were eventually removed from the island when the city sought the village land as a site for municipal services. But on one special day each August, descendants of the islanders return to their former home to hear stories of the past, share their current water experiences, eat, drink, and dance. The party begins at noon and goes on